Section 29, Part 2, Chapter 1, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This recording is in the public domain. Whenever Don Marcelo passed a bad night, suffering from nightmare, a certain terrible thing, always the same, would torment his imagination. Rarely did he dream of mortal peril to his family or self. The frightful vision was always that certain notes bearing his signature were presented for collection, which he, Marcelo Desnoyers, the man always faithful to his bond, with a past of immaculate probity, was not able to pay. Such a possibility made him tremble, and long after waking his heart would be oppressed with terror. To his imagination this was the greatest disgrace that a man could suffer. Now that war was overturning his existence with its agitations, the same agonies were reappearing. Completely awake, with full powers of reasoning, he was suffering exactly the same distress as when, in his horrible dreams, he saw his dishonored signature on a protested document. All his past was looming up before his eyes with such extraordinary clearness that it seemed as though until then his mind must have been in hopeless confusion. The threatened land of France was his native country. 15 centuries of history had been working for him in order that his opening eyes might survey progress and comforts that his ancestors did not even know. Many generations of Desnoyers had prepared for his advent into life by struggling with the land and defending it that he might be born into a free family and fireside. And when his turn had come for continuing this effort, when his time had arrived in the rosary of generations, he had fled like a debtor evading payment. On coming into his fatherland, he had contracted obligations with the human group to whom he owed his existence. This obligation should be paid with his arms, with any sacrifice that would repel danger, and he had eluded the acknowledgment of his signature, fleeing his country and betraying his trust to his forefathers. Ah, miserable coward! The material success of his life, the riches acquired in a remote country, were comparatively of no importance. There are failures that millions cannot blot out. The uneasiness of his conscience was proving it now. Proof, too, was in the envy and respect inspired by this poor mechanic, marching to meet his death with others equally humble, all kindled with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, of sacrifice accepted. The memory of Madariaga came to his memory. Where we make our riches and found a family, there is our country. No, the statement of the centaur was not correct. In normal times, perhaps, far from one's native land, when it is not exposed to danger, one may forget it for a few years. But he was living now in France, and France was being obliged to defend herself against enemies wishing to overpower her. The sight of all her people rising en masse was becoming an increasingly shameful torture for Desnoyers, making him think all the time of what he should have done in his youth, of what he had dodged. The veterans of '70 were passing through the streets with the green and black ribbon in their lapel, souvenirs of the privations of the siege of Paris and of heroic and disastrous campaigns. The sight of these men, satisfied with their past, made him turn pale. Nobody was recalling his, but he knew it, and that was enough. In vain his reason would try to lull this interior tempest. Those times were different. Then there was none of the present unanimity. The empire was unpopular. Everything was lost. But the recollection of a celebrated sentence was fixing itself in his mind as an obsession. France still remained. Many had thought as he did in his youth, but they had not, therefore, evaded military service. They had stood by their country in a last and desperate resistance. Useless was his excuse-making reasoning. Nobler thoughts showed him the fallacy of this beating around the bush. Explanations and demonstrations are unnecessary to the understanding of patriotic and religious ideals. True patriotism does not need them. One's country is one's country, and the laboring man, skeptical and jesting, the self-centered farmer, the solitary pastor, all had sprung to action at the sound of this conjuring word, comprehending it instantly without previous instruction. "It is necessary to pay," Don Marcelo kept repeating mentally. "I ought to pay my debt." As in his dreams, he was constantly feeling the anguish of an upright and desperate man who wishes to meet his obligations. Pay! And how? It was now very late. For a moment the heroic resolution came into his head of offering himself as a volunteer, of marching with his bag at his side in some one of the groups of future combatants, the same as the carpenter. But the uselessness of the sacrifice came immediately into his mind. Of what use would it be? He looked robust and was well preserved for his age, but he was over 70, and only the young make good soldiers. Combat is but one incident in the struggle. Equally necessary are the hardship and self-denial in the form of interminable marches, extremes of temperature, nights in the open air, shoveling earth, digging trenches, loading carts, suffering hunger. No, it was too late. He could not even leave an illustrious name that might serve as an example. Instinctively he glanced behind. He was not alone in the world. He had a son who could assume his father's debt. But that hope only lasted a minute. His son was not French. He belonged to another people. Half of his blood was from another source. Besides, how could the boy be expected to feel as he did? Would he even understand if his father should explain it to him? It was useless to expect anything from this lady-killing, dancing clown, from this fellow of senseless bravado, who was constantly exposing his life in duels in order to satisfy a silly sense of honor. Oh, the meekness of the bluff Senor Desnoyers! After these reflections, his family felt alarmed at seeing the humility and gentleness with which he moved around the house. The two men servants had gone to join their regiments, and to them the most surprising result of the declaration of war was the sudden kindness of their master, the lavishness of his farewell gifts, the paternal care with which he supervised their preparations for departure. The terrible Don Marcelo embraced them with moist eyes, and the two had to exert themselves to prevent his accompanying them to the station. Outside of his home, he was slipping about humbly as though mutely asking pardon of the many people around him. To him, they all appeared his superiors. It was a period of economic crisis. For the time being, the rich also were experiencing what it was to be poor and worried. The banks had suspended operations and were paying only a small part of their deposits. For some weeks, the millionaire was deprived of his wealth and felt restless before the uncertain future. How long would it be before they could send him money from South America? Was war going to take away fortunes as well as lives? And yet Desnoyers had never appreciated money less, nor disposed of it with greater generosity. Numberless mobilized men of the lower classes, who were going alone toward the station, met a gentleman who would timidly stop them, put his hand in his pocket, and leave in their right hand a bill of 20 francs, fleeing immediately before their astonished eyes. The working women who were returning, weeping from saying goodbye to their husbands, saw this same gentleman smiling at the children who were with them, patting their cheeks and hastening away, leaving a 5-franc piece in their hands. Don Marcelo, who never smoked, was now frequenting the tobacco shops, coming out with hands and pockets filled in order that he might, with lavish generosity, press the packages upon the first soldier he met. At times the recipient, smiling courteously, would thank him with a few words, revealing his superior breeding. Afterwards, passing the gift on to others, clad in cloaks as coarse and badly cut as his own. The mobilization, universally obligatory, often caused him to make these mistakes. The rough hands pressing his with a grateful clasp left him satisfied for a few moments. Ah, if only he could do more! The government, in mobilizing its vehicles, had appropriated 3 of his monumental automobiles, and Desnoyers felt very sorry that they were not also taking the 4th mastodon. Of what use were they to him? The shepherds of this monstrous herd, the chauffeur and his assistants, were now in the army. Everybody was marching away. Finally, he and his son would be the only ones left, 2 useless creatures. He roared with wrath on learning of the enemy's entrance into Belgium, considering this the most unheard of treason in history. He suffered agonies of shame at remembering that at first he had held the exalted patriots of his country responsible for the war. What perfidy, methodically carried out after long years of preparation! The accounts of the sackings, fires and butcheries made him turn pale and gnash his teeth. To him, to Marcelo Desnoyers, might happen the very same thing that Belgium was enduring if the barbarians should invade France. He had a home in the city, a castle in the country, and a family. Through association of ideas, the women assaulted by the soldiery made him think of Chichi and the dear Dona Luisa. The mansions in flames called to his mind the rare and costly furnishings accumulated in his expensive dwellings, the armorial bearings of his social elevation. The old folk that were shot, the women foully mutilated, the children with their hands cut off, all the horrors of a war of terror aroused the violence of his character. And such things could happen with impunity in this day and generation. In order to convince himself that punishment was near, that vengeance was overtaking the guilty ones, he felt the necessity of mingling daily with the people crowding around the Gare de l'Est. Although the greater part of the troops were operating on the frontiers, that was not diminishing the activity in Paris. Entire battalions were no longer going off, but day and night soldiers were coming to the station singly or in groups. These were reserves without uniform on their way to enroll themselves with their companies, officials who until then had been busy with the work of the mobilization, platoons in arms destined to fill the great gaps opened by death. The multitude, pressed against the railing, was greeting those who were going off, following them with their eyes while they were crossing the large square. The latest editions of the daily papers were announced with hoarse yells, and instantly the dark throng would be spotted with white, all reading with avidity the printed sheets. Good news! Vive la France! A doubtful dispatch, foreshadowing calamity. No matter, we must press on at all costs. The Russians will close in behind them. And while these dialogues, inspired by the latest news, were taking place, many young girls were going among the groups, offering little flags and tricolored cockades, and passing through the patio, men and still more men were disappearing behind the glass doors on their way to the war. A sub-lieutenant of the reserves, with his bag on his shoulder, was accompanied by his father toward the file of policemen keeping the crowds back. Desnoyers saw in the young officer a certain resemblance to his son. The father was wearing in his lapel the black and green ribbon of 1870, a decoration which always filled Desnoyers with remorse. He was tall and gaunt, but was still trying to hold himself erect, with a heavy frown. He wanted to show himself fierce, inhuman, in order to hide his emotion. "Goodbye, my boy. Do your best." "Goodbye, father." They did not clasp hands, and each was avoiding looking at the other. The official was smiling like an automaton. The father turned his back brusquely, and threading his way through the throng, entered a cafe where for some time he needed the most retired seat in the darkest corner to hide his emotion. And Don Marcelo envied his grief. End of section 29. Chapter 1 continued of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This recording is in the public domain. Some of the reservists came along singing, preceded by a flag. They were joking and jostling each other, betraying in excited actions long halts at all the taverns along the way. One of them, without interrupting his song, was pressing the hand of an old woman marching beside him, cheerful and dry-eyed. The mother was concentrating all her strength in order, with feigned happiness, to accompany this strapping lad to the last minute. Others were coming along singly, separated from their companies, but not on that account alone. The gun was hanging from the shoulder, the back overlaid by the hump of the knapsack, the red legs shooting in and out of the turned back folds of the blue cloak, and the smoke of a pipe under the visor of the kepis. In front of one of these men, 4 children were walking along, lined up according to size. They kept turning their heads to admire their father, suddenly glorified by his military trappings. At his side was marching his wife, affable and resigned, feeling in her simple soul a revival of love, an ephemeral spring born of the contact with danger. The man, a laborer of Paris, who a few months before was singing La Internationale, demanding the abolishment of armies and the brotherhood of all mankind, was now going in quest of death. His wife, choking back her sobs, was admiring him greatly. Affection and commiseration made her insist upon giving him a few last counsels. In his knapsack she had put his best handkerchiefs, the few provisions in the house, and all the money. Her man was not to be uneasy about her and the children. They would get along all right. The government and kind neighbors would look after them. The soldier, in reply, was jesting over the somewhat misshapen figure of his wife, saluting the coming citizen, and prophesying that he would be born in a time of great victory. A kiss to the wife, an affectionate hair pull for his offspring, and then he had joined his comrades. No tears, courage, vive la France! The final injunctions of the departing were now heard. Nobody was crying. But as the last red pantaloons disappeared, many hands grasped the iron railing convulsively, many handkerchiefs were bitten with gnashing teeth, many faces were hidden in the arms with sobs of anguish, and Don Marcelo envied these tears. The old woman, on losing the warm contact of her son's hand from her withered one, turned in the direction which she believed to be that of the hostile country, waving her arms with threatening fury. Ah, the assassin! The bandit! In her wrathful imagination she was again seeing the countenance so often displayed in the illustrated pages of the periodicals, mustaches insolently aggressive, a mouth with the jaw and teeth of a wolf that laughed and laughed as men must have laughed in the time of the cavemen. And Don Marcelo envied this wrath. End of section 30. Part 2, Chapter 2 of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, New Life. When Marguerite was able to return to the studio in the Rue de la Pompe, Julio, who had been living in a perpetual bad humor, seeing everything in the blackest colors, suddenly felt a return of his old optimism. The war was not going to be so cruel as they all had at first imagined. The day had passed by, and the movements of the troops were beginning to be less noticeable. As the number of men diminished in the streets, the feminine population seemed to have increased. Although there was great scarcity of money, the banks still remained closed. The necessity for it was increasingly great in order to secure provisions. Memories of the famine of the siege of '70 tormented the imagination. Since war had broken out with the same enemy, it seemed but logical to everybody to expect a repetition of the same happenings. The storehouses were besieged by women who were securing stale food at exorbitant prices in order to store it in their homes. Future hunger was producing more terror than immediate dangers. For young Desnoyers, these were about all the transformations that war was creating around him. People would finally become accustomed to the new existence. Humanity has a certain reserve force of adaptation which enables it to mold itself to circumstances and continue existing. He was hoping to continue his life as though nothing had happened. It was enough for him that Marguerite should continue faithful to their past. Together they would see events slipping by them with the cruel luxuriousness of those who, from an inaccessible height, contemplate a flood without the slightest risk to themselves. This selfish attitude had also become habitual to Argensola. "Let us be neutral," the Bohemian would say. "Neutrality does not necessarily mean indifference. Let us enjoy the great spectacle, since nothing like it will ever happen again in our lifetime." It was unfortunate that war should happen to come when they had so little money. Argensola was hating the banks even more than the Central Powers, distinguishing with special antipathy the trust company which was delaying payment of Julio's check. How lovely it would have been, with this sum available, to have forestalled events by laying in every class of commodity. In order to supplement the domestic scrimping, he again had to solicit the aid of Dona Luisa. War had lessened Don Marcelo's precautions, and the family was now living in generous unconcern. The mother, like other house mistresses, had stored up provisions for months and months to come, buying whatever eatables she was able to lay hands on. Argensola took advantage of this abundance, repeating his visits to the home in the avenue Victor Hugo, descending its service stairway with great packages which were swelling the supplies in the studio. He felt all the joys of a good housekeeper in surveying the treasures piled up in the kitchen: great tins of canned meat, pyramids of butter crocks, and bags of dried vegetables. He had accumulated enough there to maintain a large family. The war had now offered a new pretext for him to visit Don Marcelo's wine vaults. "Let them come," he would say with a heroic gesture as he took stock of his treasure trove. "Let them come when they will. We are ready for them." The care and increase of his provisions and the investigation of news were the two functions of his existence. It seemed necessary to procure 10, 12, 15 papers a day. Some because they were reactionary, and the novelty of seeing all the French united filled him with enthusiasm. Others because they were radical and must be better informed of the news received from the government. They generally appeared at midday, at 3, at 4, and at 5 in the afternoon. A half hour's delay in the publication of the sheet raised great hopes in the public, on the qui vive for stupendous news. All the last supplements were snatched up. Everybody had his pockets stuffed with papers, waiting anxiously the issue of extras in order to buy them too. Yet all the sheets were saying approximately the same thing. Argensola was developing a credulous, enthusiastic soul, capable of admitting many improbable things. He presumed that this same spirit was probably animating everybody around him. At times his old critical attitude would threaten to rebel, but doubt was repulsed as something dishonorable. He was living in a new world, and it was but natural that extraordinary things should occur that could be neither measured nor explained by the old processes of reasoning. So he commented with infantile joy on the marvelous accounts in the daily papers of combats between a single Belgian platoon and entire regiments of enemies, putting them to disorderly flight; of the German fear of the bayonet that made them run like hares, the instant that the charge sounded, of the inefficiency of the German artillery, whose projectiles always missed fire. It was logical and natural that little Belgium should conquer gigantic Germany, a repetition of David and Goliath, with all the metaphors and images that this unequal contest had inspired across so many centuries. Like the greater part of the nation, he had the mentality of a reader of tales of chivalry, who feels himself defrauded if the hero, single-handed, fails to cleave 1,000 enemies with one fell stroke. He purposely chose the most sensational papers, those which published many stories of single encounters, of individual deeds about which nobody could know with any degree of certainty. The intervention of England on the seas made him imagine a frightful famine coming providentially like a thunderclap to torture the enemy. He honestly believed that 10 days of this maritime blockade would convert Germany into a group of shipwrecked sailors floating on a raft. This vision made him repeat his visits to the kitchen to gloat over his packages of provisions. Ah, what they would give in Berlin for my treasures! Never had Argensola eaten with greater avidity. Consideration of the great privations suffered by the adversary was sharpening his appetite to a monstrous capacity. White bread, golden brown and crusty, was stimulating him to an almost religious ecstasy. If friend William could only get his claws on this, he would chuckle to his companion. So he chewed and swallowed with increasing relish. Solids and liquids, on passing through his mouth, seemed to be acquiring a new flavor, rare and divine. Distant hunger for him was a stimulant, a source of endless delight. While France was inspiring his enthusiasm, he was conceding greater credit to Russia. Ah, those Cossacks! He was accustomed to speak of them as intimate friends. He loved to describe the unbridled gallop of the wild horsemen, impalpable as phantoms and so terrible in their wrath that the enemy could not look them in the face. The concierge and the stay-at-homes used to listen to him with all the respect due to a foreign gentleman, knowing much of the great outside world with which they were not familiar. "The Cossacks will adjust the accounts of these bandits," he would conclude with absolute assurance. "Within a month they will have entered Berlin." And his public, composed of women, wives, and mothers of those who had gone to war, would modestly agree with him, with that irresistible desire which we all feel of placing our hopes on something distant and mysterious. The French would defend the country, reconquering besides the lost territories. But the Cossacks, of whom so many were speaking but so few had seen, were going to give the death blow. The only person who knew them at first hand was Tchernoff, and to Argensola's astonishment, he listened to his words without showing any enthusiasm. The Cossacks were for him simply one body of the Russian army, good enough soldiers, but incapable of working miracles that everybody was expecting from them. "That Tchernoff!" exclaimed Argensola. "Since he hates the Czar, he thinks the entire country mad. He is a revolutionary fanatic, and I am opposed to all fanaticisms." Julio was listening absent-mindedly to the news brought by his companion, the vibrating statements recited in declamatory tones, the plans of the campaign traced out on an enormous map fastened to the wall of the studio and bristling with tiny flags that marked the camps of the belligerent armies. Every issue of the papers obliged the Spaniard to arrange a new dance of the pins on the map, followed by his comments of bomb-proof optimism. "We have entered into Alsace. Very good. It appears now that we abandon Alsace. Splendid! I suspect the cause. It is in order to enter again in a better place, getting at the enemy from behind. They say that Liege has fallen. What a lie! And if it does fall, it doesn't matter. Just an incident, nothing more. The others remain, the others that are advancing on the eastern side and are going to enter Berlin." The news from the Russian front was his favorite, but obliged him to remain in suspense every time that he tried to find on the map the obscure names of the places where the admired Cossacks were exhibiting their wonderful exploits. Meanwhile, Julio was continuing the course of his own reflections. Marguerite! She had come back at last, and yet each time seemed to be drifting further away from him. In the first days of the mobilization, he had haunted her neighborhood, trying to appease his longing by this illusory proximity. Marguerite had written to him urging patience. How fortunate it was that he was a foreigner and would not have to endure the hardship of war. Her brother, an officer in the artillery reserves, was going at almost any minute. Her mother, who made her home with this bachelor son, had kept an astonishing serenity up to the last minute, although she had wept much while the war was still but a possibility. She herself had prepared the soldier's outfit so that the small valise might contain all that was indispensable for campaign life. But Marguerite had divined her poor mother's secret struggles not to reveal her despair in moist eyes and trembling hands. It was impossible to leave her alone at such a time. Then had come the farewell. "God be with you, my son. Do your duty, but be prudent. Not a tear, not a sign of weakness." All her family had advised her not to accompany her son to the railway station. So his sister had gone with him, and upon returning home, Marguerite had found her mother rigid in her armchair, with a set face, avoiding all mention of her son, speaking of the friends who had also sent their boys to the war, as if they only could comprehend her torture. "Poor mama! I ought to be with her now more than ever. Tomorrow, if I can, I shall come to see you." When at last she returned to the Rue de la Pompe, her first care was to explain to Julio the conservatism of her tailored suit, the absence of jewels in the adornment of her person. "The war, my dear. Now it is the chic thing to adapt oneself to the depressing conditions, to be frugal and inconspicuous like soldiers. Who knows what we may expect?" Her infatuation with dress still accompanied her in every moment of her life. Julio noticed a persistent absent-mindedness about her. It seemed as though her spirit, abandoning her body, was wandering to far away places. Her eyes were looking at him, but she seldom saw him. She would speak very slowly, as though wishing to weigh every word, fearful of betraying some secret. This spiritual alienation did not, however, prevent her from slipping bodily along the smooth path of custom, although afterward she would seem to feel a vague remorse. "I wonder if it is right to do this? Is it not wrong to live like this when so many sorrows are falling on the world?" Julio hushed her scruples with, "But if we are going to marry as soon as possible, if we are already the same as husband and wife?" She replied with a gesture of strangeness and dismay. To marry! 10 days ago she had had no other wish. Now the possibility of marriage was recurring less and less in her thoughts. Why think about such remote and uncertain events? More immediate things were occupying her mind. The farewell to her brother in the station was a scene which had fixed itself ineradicably in her memory. Upon going to the studio she had planned not to speak about it, foreseeing that she might annoy her lover with this account. But alas! She had only to vow not to mention a thing to feel an irresistible impulse to talk about it. She had never suspected that she could love her brother so dearly. Her former affection for him had been mingled with a silent sentiment of jealousy because her mother had preferred the older child. Besides, he was the one who had introduced Laurier to his home. The two held diplomas as industrial engineers and had been close friends from their school days. But upon seeing the boy ready to depart, Marguerite suddenly discovered that this brother, who had always been of secondary interest to her, was now occupying a preeminent place in her affections. He was so handsome, so interesting in his lieutenant's uniform. He looked like another person. I will admit to you that I was very proud to walk beside him, leaning on his arm. People thought that we were married. Seeing me weep, some poor women tried to console me, saying, 'Courage, Madame, your man will come back.' He just laughed at hearing these mistakes. The only thing that was really saddening him was thinking about our mother." They had separated at the door of the station. The sentries would not let her go any further, so she had handed over his sword that she had wished to carry till the last moment. "It is lovely to be a man!" she exclaimed enthusiastically. "I would love to wear a uniform, to go to war, to be of some real use." She tried not to say more about it, as though she suddenly realized the inopportuneness of her last words. Perhaps she noticed the scowl on Julio's face. She was, however, so wrought up by the memory of that farewell that, after a long pause, she was unable to resist the temptation of again putting her thought into words. At the station entrance, while she was kissing her brother for the last time, she had an encounter, a great surprise. He had approached, also clad as an artillery officer, but alone, having to entrust his valise to a good-natured man from the crowd. Julio shot her a questioning look. Who was he? He suspected, but feigned ignorance, as though fearing to learn the truth. "Laurier," she replied laconically, "my former husband." The lover displayed a cruel irony. It was a cowardly thing to ridicule this man who had responded to the call of duty. He recognized his vileness, but a malign and irresistible instinct made him keep on with his sneers in order to discredit the man before Marguerite. Laurier, a soldier! He must cut a pretty figure dressed in uniform. Laurier, the warrior! He continued in a voice so sarcastic and strange that it seemed to be coming from somebody else. Poor creature! She hesitated in her response, not wishing to exasperate Desnoyers any further, but the truth was uppermost in her mind, and she said simply: "No, no, he didn't look so bad. Quite the contrary. Perhaps it was the uniform. Perhaps it was his sadness at going away alone, completely alone, without a single hand to clasp his. I didn't recognize him at first. Seeing my brother, he started toward us, but then when he saw me, he went his own way. Poor man, I feel sorry for him." Her feminine instinct must have told her that she was talking too much, and she cut her chatter suddenly short. The same instinct warned her that Julio's countenance was growing more and more saturnine, and his mouth taking a very bitter curve. She wanted to console him, and added: "What luck that you are a foreigner and will not have to go to the war. How horrible it would be for me to lose you!" She said it sincerely. A few moments before she had been envying men, admiring the gallantry with which they were exposing their lives, and now she was trembling before the idea that her lover might have been one of these. This did not please his amorous egoism. To be placed apart from the rest as a delicate and fragile being, only fit for feminine adoration. He preferred to inspire the envy that she had felt on beholding her brother decked out in his warlike accoutrement. It seemed to him that something was coming between him and Marguerite that would never disappear, that would go on expanding, repelling them in contrary directions, far, very far, even to the point of not recognizing each other when their glances met. He continued to be conscious of this impalpable obstacle in their following interviews. Marguerite was extremely affectionate in her speech, and would look at him with moist and loving eyes, but her caressing hands appeared more like those of a mother than a lover, and her tenderness was accompanied with a certain disinterestedness and extraordinary modesty. She seemed to prefer remaining obstinately in the studio, declining to go into the other rooms. "We are so comfortable here. I would rather not. It is not worth while. I should feel remorse afterwards. Why think of such things in these anxious times?" The world around her seemed saturated with love, but it was a new love, a love for the man who is suffering, desire for abnegation, for sacrifice. This love called forth visions of white caps, of tremulous hands healing shell-riddled and bleeding flesh. Every advance on Julio's part but aroused in Marguerite a vehement and modest protest, as though they were meeting for the first time. "It is impossible!" she protested. "I keep thinking of my brother and of so many that I know that may be dying at this very minute." News of battles were beginning to arrive, and blood was beginning to flow in great quantities. "No, no, I cannot," she kept repeating. And when Julio finally triumphed, he found that her thoughts were still following independently the same line of mental stress. One afternoon, Marguerite announced that henceforth she would see him less frequently. She was attending classes now, and had only 2 free days. Desnoyers listened dumbfounded. Classes? What were her studies? She seemed a little irritated at his mocking expression. Yes, she was studying. For the past week she had been attending classes. Now the lessons were going to be more regular, the course of instruction had been fully organized, and there were many more instructors. "I wish to be a trained nurse. I am distressed over my uselessness. Of what good have I ever been till now?" She was silent for a few moments as though reviewing her past. "At times I almost think," she mused, "that war, with all its horrors, still has some good in it. It helps to make us useful to our fellow men. We look at life more seriously. Trouble makes us realize that we have come into the world for some purpose. I believe that we must not love life only for the pleasures that it brings us. We ought to find satisfaction in sacrifice, in dedicating ourselves to others. And this satisfaction, I don't know just why, perhaps because it is new, appears to me superior to all other things." Julio looked at her in surprise, trying to imagine what was going on in that idolized and frivolous head. What ideas were forming back of that thoughtful forehead, which until then had merely reflected the slightest shadow of thoughts as swift and flitting as birds. But the former Marguerite was still alive. He saw her constantly reappearing in a funny way among the sombre preoccupations with which war was overshadowing all lives. "We have to study very hard in order to earn our diplomas as nurses. Have you noticed our uniform? It is most distinctive, and the white is so becoming both to blondes and brunettes. Then the cap, which allows little curls over the ears, the fashionable coiffure, and the blue cape over the white suit make a splendid contrast. With this outfit, a woman well shod and with few jewels may present a truly chic appearance. It is a mixture of nun and great lady which is vastly becoming." She was going to study with a regular fury in order to become really useful, and sooner to wear the admired uniform. Poor Desnoyers! The longing to see her and the lack of occupation in these interminable afternoons, which hitherto had been employed so delightfully, compelled him to haunt the neighborhood of the unoccupied palace, where the government had just established the training school for nurses. Stationing himself at the corner, watching the fluttering skirts and quick steps of the feminine feet on the sidewalk, he imagined that the course of time must have turned backward, and that he was still but 18, the same as when he used to hang around the establishments of some celebrated modiste. The groups of women that at certain hours came out of the palace suggested these former days. They were dressed extremely quietly, the aspect of many of them as humble as that of the seamstresses. But they were ladies of the well-to-do class, some even coming in automobiles driven by chauffeurs in military uniform, because they were ministerial vehicles. These long waits often brought him unexpected encounters with the elegant students who were going and coming. "Desnoyers!" some feminine voices would exclaim behind him. "Isn't it Desnoyers?" And he would find himself obliged to relieve their doubts, saluting the ladies who were looking at him as though he were a ghost. They were friends of a remote epoch, of 6 months ago, ladies who had admired and pursued him, trusting sweetly to his masterly wisdom to guide them through the 7 circles of the science of the tango. They were now scrutinizing him as if between their last encounter and the present moment had occurred a great cataclysm, transforming all the laws of existence, as if he were the sole survivor of a vanished race. Eventually they all asked the same questions. "Are you not not going to the war? How is it that you are not wearing a uniform?" He would attempt to explain, but at his first words they would interrupt him. "That's so, you are a foreigner." They would say it with a certain envy, doubtless thinking of their loved ones now suffering the privations and dangers of war. But the fact that he was a foreigner would instantly create a vague atmosphere of spiritual aloofness, an alienation that Julio had not known in the good old days when people sought each other without considering nationality, without feeling that disavowal of danger which isolates and concentrates human groups. The ladies generally bade him adieu with malicious suspicion. What was he doing hanging around there, in search of his usual lucky adventure? And their smiles were rather grave, the smiles of older folk who know the true significance of life and commiserate the deluded ones still seeking diversion in frivolities. This attitude was as annoying to Julio as though it were a manifestation of pity. They were supposing him still exercising the only function of which he was capable. He wasn't good for anything else. On the other hand, these empty heads, still keeping something of their old appearance, now appeared animated by the grand sentiment of maternity, an abstract maternity which seemed to be extending to all the men of the nation, a desire for self-sacrifice, of knowing firsthand the privations of the lowly, and aiding all the ills that flesh is heir to. This same yearning was inspiring Marguerite when she came away from her lessons. She was advancing from one overpowering dread to another, accepting the first rudiments of surgery as the greatest of scientific marvels. At the same time, she was astonished at the avidity with which she was assimilating these hitherto unsuspected mysteries. Sometimes, with a funny assumption of assurance, she would even believe that she had mistaken her vocation. "Who knows but I was born to be a famous doctor?" she would exclaim. End of Section 31. Chapter 2 continued of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Her great fear was that she might lose her self-control when the time came to put her newly acquired knowledge into practice. To see herself before the foul odors of decomposing flesh, to contemplate the flow of blood, a horrible thing for her who had always felt an invincible repugnance toward all the unpleasant conditions of ordinary life. But these hesitations were short, and she was suddenly animated by a dashing energy. These were times of sacrifice. Were not men snatched every day from the comforts of sensuous existence to endure the rude life of a soldier? She would be a soldier in petticoats, facing pain, battling with it, plunging her hands into putrefaction, flashing like a ray of sunlight into the places where soldiers were expecting the approach of death. She proudly narrated to Desnoyers all the progress that she was making in the training school, the complicated bandages that she was learning to adjust, sometimes over a mannikin, at others over the flesh of an employee, trying to play the part of a sorely wounded patient. She, so dainty, so incapable in her own home of the slightest physical effort, was learning the most skillful ways of lifting a human body from the ground and carrying it on her back. Who knew but that she might render this very service some day on the battlefield? She was ready for the greatest risks, with the ignorant audacity of women impelled by flashes of heroism. All her admiration was for the English army nurses, slender women of nervous vigor whose photographs were appearing in the papers, wearing pantaloons, riding boots, and white helmets. Julio listened to her with astonishment. Was this woman really Marguerite? War was obliterating all her winning vanities. She was no longer fluttering about in bird-like fashion. Her feet were treading the earth with resolute firmness, calm and secure in the new strength which was developing within. When one of his caresses would remind her that she was a woman, she would always say the same thing: "What luck that you are a foreigner! What happiness to know that you do not have to go to war!" In her anxiety for sacrifice, she wanted to go to the battlefields, and yet at the same time she was rejoicing to see her lover exempt from military duty. This preposterous lack of logic was not gratefully received by Julio, but irritated him as an unconscious offense. "One might suppose that she was protecting me," he thought. "She is the man, and rejoices that I, the weak comrade, should be protected from danger. What a grotesque situation!" Fortunately, at times when Marguerite presented herself at the studio, she was again her old self, making him temporarily forget his annoyance. She would arrive with the same joy in a vacation that the college student or the employee feels on a holiday. Responsibility was teaching her to know the value of time. "No classes today," she would call out on entering, and tossing her hat on a divan, she would begin a dance step, retreating with infantile coquetry from the arms of her lover. But in a few minutes she would recover her customary gravity, the serious look that had become habitual with her since the outbreak of hostilities. She spoke often of her mother, always sad, but striving to hide her grief and keeping herself up in the hope of a letter from her son. She spoke, too, of the war, commenting on the latest events with the rhetorical optimism of the official dispatches. She could describe the first flag taken from the enemy as minutely as though it were a garment of unparalleled elegance. From a window she had seen the minister of war. She was very much affected when repeating the story of some fugitive Belgians recently arrived at the hospital. They were the only patients that she had been able to assist until now. Paris was not receiving the soldiers wounded in battle. By order of the government, they were being sent from the front to the hospitals in the south. She no longer evinced toward Julio the resistance of the first few days. Her training as a nurse was giving her a certain passivity. She seemed to be ignoring material attractions, stripping them of the spiritual importance which she had hitherto attributed to them. She wanted to make Julio happy, although her mind was concentrated on other matters. One afternoon she felt the necessity of communicating certain news which had been filling her mind since the day before. Springing up from the couch, she hunted for her handbag, which contained a letter. She wanted to read it again, to tell its contents to somebody with that irresistible impulse which forestalls confession. It was a letter which her brother had sent her from the Vosges. In it he spoke of Laurier more than of himself. They belonged to different batteries, but were in the same division, and had taken part in the same combats. The officer was filled with admiration for his former brother-in-law. Who could have guessed that a future hero was hidden within that silent and tranquil engineer? But he was a genuine hero just the same. All the officials had agreed with Marguerite's brother on seeing how calmly he fulfilled his duty, facing death with the same coolness as though he were in his factory near Paris. He had asked for the dangerous post of lookout, slipping as near as possible to the enemy's lines in order to verify the exactitude of the artillery discharge, rectifying it by telephone. A German shell had demolished the house on the roof of which he was concealed, and Laurier, on crawling out unhurt from the ruins, had readjusted his telephone and gone tranquilly on, continuing the same work in the shelter of a nearby grove. His battery, picked out by the enemy's aeroplanes, had received the concentrated fire of the artillery opposite. In a few minutes all the force were rolling on the ground, the captain and many soldiers dead, officers wounded, and almost all the gunners. There only remained as chief Laurier, the impassive, as his comrades nicknamed him, and aided by the few artillerymen still on their feet, he continued firing under a rain of iron and fire so as to cover the retreat of a battalion. "He has been mentioned twice in dispatches," Marguerite continued reading. "I do not believe it will be long before they give him the cross. He is valiant in every way. Who would have supposed all this a few weeks ago?" She did not share the general astonishment. Living with Laurier had many times shown her the intrepidity of his character, the fearlessness concealed under that placid exterior. On that account, her instincts had warned her against rousing her husband's wrath in the first days of her infidelity. She still remembered the way he looked the night he surprised her leaving Julio's home. His was the passion that kills, and nevertheless he had not attempted the least violence with her. The memory of his consideration was awakening in Marguerite a sentiment of gratitude. Perhaps he had loved her as no other man had. Her eyes, with an irresistible desire for comparison, sought Julio's, admiring his youthful grace and distinction. The image of Laurier, heavy and ordinary, came into her mind as a consolation. Certainly the officer whom she had seen at the station when saying good bye to her brother did not seem to her like her old husband. But Marguerite wished to forget the pallid lieutenant with the sad countenance, who had passed before her eyes, preferring to remember him only as the manufacturer preoccupied with profits and incapable of comprehending what she was accustomed to call the delicate refinements of a chic woman. Decidedly, Julio was the more fascinating. She did not repent of her past; she did not wish to repent of it. And her loving selfishness made her repeat once more the same old exclamation: "How fortunate that you are a foreigner! What a relief to know that you are safe from the dangers of war!" Julio felt the usual exasperation at hearing this. He came very near to closing his beloved's mouth with his hand. Was she trying to make fun of him? It was fairly insulting to place him apart from other men. Meanwhile, with blind irrelevance, she persisted in talking about Laurier, commenting upon his achievements. "I do not love him. I never have loved him. Do not look so cross. How could the poor man ever be compared with you? You must admit, though, that his new existence is rather interesting. I rejoice in his brave deeds as though an old friend had done them, a family visitor who I had not seen for a long time. The poor man deserved a better fate. He ought to have married some other woman, some companion more on a level with his ideals. I tell you that I really pity him." And this pity was so intense that her eyes filled up with tears, awakening the tortures of jealousy in her lover. After these interviews, Desnoyers was more ill-tempered and despondent than ever. "I am beginning to realize that we are in a false position," he said one morning to Argensola. "Life is going to become increasingly painful. It is difficult to remain tranquil, continuing the same old existence in the midst of a people at war." His companion had about come to the same conclusion. He, too, was beginning to feel that the life of a young foreigner in Paris was insufferable now that it was so upset by war. One has to keep showing passports all the time in order that the police may be sure that they have not discovered a deserter. In the streetcar the other afternoon, I had to explain that I was a Spaniard to some girls who were wondering why I was not at the front. One of them, as soon as she learned my nationality, asked me with great simplicity why I did not offer myself as a volunteer. Now they have invented a word for the stay-at-homes, calling them les embusqués, the hidden ones. I am sick and tired of the ironical looks shot at me wherever I go. It makes me wild to be taken for an embusqué." A flash of heroism was galvanizing the impressionable bohemian. Now that everybody was going to war, he was wishing to do the same thing. He was not afraid of death. The only thing that was disturbing to him was the military service, the uniform, the mechanical obedience to bugle call, the blind subservience to the chiefs. Fighting was not offering any difficulties for him, but his nature capriciously resented everything in the form of discipline. The foreign groups in Paris were trying to organize each its own legion of volunteers, and he, too, was planning his, a battalion of Spaniards and South Americans, reserving naturally the presidency of the organizing committee for himself, and later the command of the body. He had inserted notices in the papers making the studio in the rue de la Pompe the recruiting office. In 10 days 2 volunteers had presented themselves. A clerk, shivering in midsummer, who stipulated that he should be an officer because he was wearing a suitable jacket, and a Spanish tavern keeper who, at the very outset, had wished to rob Argensola of his command on the feudal pretext that he was a soldier in his youth, while the Bohemian was only an artist. 20 Spanish battalions were attempted with the same result in different parts of Paris. Each enthusiast wished to be commander of the others, with the individual haughtiness and aversion to discipline so characteristic of the race. Finally, the future generalissimos decided to enlist as simple volunteers, but in a French regiment. "I am waiting to see what the Garibaldis do," said Argensola modestly. "Perhaps I may go with them." This glorious name made military service conceivable to him. But then he vacillated. He would certainly have to obey somebody in this body of volunteers, and he did not believe in an obedience that was not preceded by long discussions. What next? "Life has changed in a fortnight," he continued. "It seems as if we were living in another planet. Our former achievements are not appreciated. Others, most obscure and poor, those who formerly had the least consideration, are now promoted to the first ranks. The refined man of complex spirituality has disappeared for who knows how many years. Now the simple minded man climbs triumphantly to the top, because, though his ideas are limited, they are sure, and he knows how to obey. We are no longer the style." Desnoyers assented. It was so. They were no longer fashionable. None knew that better than he. For he who was once the sensation of the day was now passing as a stranger among the very people who a few months before had raved over him. "Your reign is over," laughed Argensola. "The fact that you are a handsome fellow doesn't help you one bit nowadays. In a uniform and with a cross on my breast, I could soon get the best of you in a rival love affair. In times of peace, the officers only set the girls of the provinces to dreaming. But now that we are at war, there has awakened in every woman the ancestral enthusiasm that her remote grandmothers used to feel for the strong and aggressive beast. The high-born dames who a few months ago were complicating their desires with psychological subtleties are now admiring the military man with the same simplicity that the maid has for the common soldier. Before a uniform, they feel the humble and servile enthusiasm of the female of the lower animals before the crests, foretops, and gay plumes of the fighting males. Look out, master! We shall have to follow the new course of events or resign ourselves to everlasting obscurity. The tango is dead." And Desnoyers agreed that truly they were two beings on the other side of the river of life, which at one bound had changed its course. There was no longer any place in the new existence for that poor painter of souls, nor for that hero of a frivolous life, who from 5 to 7 every afternoon had attained the triumphs most envied by mankind. End of section 32. Part 2, Chapter 3 of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3: The Retreat. War had extended one of its antennae even to the Avenue Victor Hugo. It was a silent war in which the enemy, bland, shapeless, and gelatinous, seemed constantly to be escaping from the hands only to renew hostilities a little later on. "I have Germany in my own house," growled Marcelo Desnoyers. Germany was Dona Elena, the wife of von Hartrott. Why had not her son, that professor of inexhaustible sufficiency, whom he now believed to have been a spy, taken her home with him? For what sentimental caprice had she wished to stay with her sister, losing the opportunity of returning to Berlin before the frontiers were closed? The presence of this woman in his home was the cause of many compunctions and alarms. Fortunately, the chauffeur and all the men servants were in the army. The two chinas received an order in a threatening tone. They must be very careful when talking to the French maids. Not the slightest allusion to the nationality of Dona Elena's husband, nor to the residence of her family. Dona Elena was an Argentinian, but in spite of the silence of the maids, Don Marcelo was always in fear of some outburst of exalted patriotism, and that his wife's sister might suddenly find herself confined in a concentration camp under suspicion of having dealings with the enemy. Frau von Hartrott made his uneasiness worse. Instead of keeping a discreet silence, she was constantly introducing discord into the home with her opinions. During the first days of the war, she kept herself locked in her room, joining the family only when summoned to the dining room. With tightly puckered mouth and an absent-minded air, she would then seat herself at the table, pretending not to hear Don Marcelo's verbal outpourings of enthusiasm. He enjoyed describing the departure of the troops, the moving scenes in the streets and at the stations, commenting on events with an optimism sure of the first news of the war. Two things were beyond all discussion. The bayonet was the secret of the French, and the Germans were shuddering with terror before its fatal, glistening point. The .75 cannon had proved itself a unique jewel, its shots being absolutely sure. He was really feeling sorry for the enemy's artillery, since its projectiles so seldom exploded, even when well aimed. Furthermore, the French troops had entered victoriously into Alsace. Many little towns were already theirs. Now it is as it was in the '70s, he would exult, brandishing his fork and waving his napkin. We are going to kick them back to the other side of the Rhine. Kick them, that's the word. Chichi always agreed gleefully while Dona Elena was raising her eyes to heaven, as though silently calling upon somebody hidden in the ceiling to bear witness to such errors and blasphemies. The kind Dona Luisa always sought her out afterwards in the retirement of her room, believing it necessary to give sisterly counsel to one living so far from home. The Romantica did not maintain her austere silence before her sister, who had always venerated her superior instruction. So now the poor lady was overwhelmed with accounts of the stupendous forces of Germany, enunciated with all the authority of a wife of a great Teutonic patriot and a mother of an almost celebrated professor. According to her graphic picture, millions of men were now surging forth in enormous streams, thousands of cannons were filing by, and tremendous mortars like monstrous turrets. And towering above all this vast machinery of destruction was a man who alone was worth an army, a being who knew everything and could do everything, handsome, intelligent, and infallible as a god, the Emperor. "The French just don't know what's ahead of them," declared Dona Elena. "We are going to annihilate them. It is merely a matter of 2 weeks. Before August is ended, the Emperor will have entered Paris." Senora Desnoyers was so greatly impressed by these dire prophecies that she could not hide them from her family. Chichi waxed indignant at her mother's credulity and her aunt's Germanism. Martial fervor was flaming up in the former peoncito. Ay, if only women could go to war! She enjoyed picturing herself on horseback in command of a regiment of dragoons, charging the enemy with other Amazons as dashing and buxom as she. Then her fondness for skating would predominate over her tastes for the cavalry, and she would long to be an Alpine hunter, a diable bleu, among those who slid on long runners with muskets slung across the back and alpenstock in hand, over the snowy slopes of the Vosges. But the government did not appreciate the valorous women, and she could obtain no other part in the war but to admire the uniform of her true love, Rene Lacour, converted into a soldier. The senator's son certainly looked beautiful. He was tall and fair, of a rather feminine type recalling his dead mother. In his fiancee's opinion, Rene was just a little sugar soldier. At first she had been very proud to walk the streets by the side of this warrior, believing that his uniform had greatly augmented his personal charm. But little by little a revulsion of feeling was clouding her joy. The senatorial prince was nothing but a common soldier. His illustrious father, fearful that the war might cut off forever the dynasty of the Lacours, indispensable to the welfare of the state, had had his son mustered into the auxiliary service of the army. By this arrangement, his heir need not leave Paris, ranking about as high as those who were kneading the bread or mending the soldiers' cloaks. Only by going to the front could he claim, as a student of the Ecole Centrale, his title of sub-lieutenant in the artillery reserves. "What happiness for me that you have to stay in Paris! How delighted I am that you are just a private!" And yet, at the same time, Chichi was thinking enviously of her friends whose lovers and brothers were officers. They could parade the streets, escorted by a gold-trimmed kepis that attracted the notice of the passers-by and the respectful salute of the lower ranks. Each time that Dona Luisa, terrified by the forecasts of her sister, undertook to communicate her dismay to her daughter, the girl would rage up and down, exclaiming: "What lies my aunt tells you! Since her husband is a German, she sees everything as he wishes it to be. Papa knows more. Rene's father is better informed about these things. We are going to give them a thorough hiding. What fun it will be when they hit my uncle and all my snippy cousins in Berlin!" "Hush!" groaned her mother. "Do not talk such nonsense. The war has turned you as crazy as your father." The good lady was scandalized at hearing the outburst of savage desires that the mere mention of the Kaiser always aroused in her daughter. In times of peace, Chichi had rather admired this personage. "He's not so bad looking," she had commented, but with a very ordinary smile. Now all her wrath was concentrated upon him. The thousands of women that were weeping through his fault, the mothers without sons, the wives without husbands, the poor children left in the burning towns. Ah, the vile wretch! And she would brandish her knife of the old Peoncito days. A dagger with silver handle and sheath, richly chased, a gift that her grandfather had exhumed from some forgotten souvenirs of his childhood in an old valise. The very first German that she came across was doomed to death. Dona Luisa was terrified to find her flourishing this weapon before her dressing mirror. She was no longer yearning to be a cavalryman nor a diable bleu. She would be entirely content if they would leave her alone in some closed space with the detested monster. In just 5 minutes she would settle the universal conflict. "Defend yourself, Boche!" she would shriek, standing at guard as in her childhood she had seen the peons doing on the ranch. And with a knife thrust above and below, she would pierce his imperial vitals. Immediately there resounded in her imagination shouts of joy, the gigantic sigh of millions of women freed at last from the bloody nightmare, thanks to her playing the role of Judith or Charlotte Corday, or a blend of all the heroic women who had killed for the common weal. Her savage fury made her continue her imaginary slaughter, dagger in hand. Second stroke, the crown prince rolling on one side and his head to the other. A rain of dagger thrusts. All the invincible generals of whom her aunt had been boasting, fleeing with their insides in their hands, and bringing up the rear that fawning lackey who wished to receive the same things as those of highest rank, the uncle from Berlin. Ah, if she could only get the chance to make these longings a reality! "You are mad," protested her mother, "completely mad. How can a ladylike girl talk in such a way?" Surprising her niece in the ecstasy of these delirious ravings, Dona Elena would raise her eyes to heaven, abstaining thenceforth from communicating her opinions, reserving them wholly for the mother. Don Marcelo's indignation took another bound when his wife repeated to him the news from her sister. All a lie! The war was progressing finely. On the eastern frontier the French troops had advanced through the interior of Alsace and Lorraine. "But Belgium is invaded, isn't it?" asked Dona Luisa. "And those poor Belgians!" Desnoyers retorted indignantly, "That invasion of Belgium is a treason, and a treason never amounts to anything among decent people." He said it in all good faith, as though war were a duel in which the traitor was henceforth ruled out and unable to continue his outrages. Besides, the heroic resistance of Belgium was nourishing the most absurd illusions in his heart. The Belgians were certainly supernatural men, destined to the most stupendous achievements. And to think that heretofore he had never taken this plucky little nation into account! For several days he considered Liege a holy city before whose walls the Teutonic power would be completely confounded. Upon the fall of Liege, his unquenchable faith sought another handle. There were still remaining many other Lieges in the interior. The Germans might force their way further in, then we would see how many of them ever succeeded in getting out. The entry into Brussels did not disquiet him. An unprotected city, its surrender was a foregone conclusion. Now the Belgians would be better able to defend Antwerp. Neither did the advance of the Germans toward the French frontier alarm him at all. In vain his sister-in-law, with malicious brevity, mentioned in the dining room the progress of the invasion, so confusedly outlined in the daily papers. The Germans were already at the frontier. "And what of that?" yelled Don Marcelo. "Soon they will meet someone to talk to. Joffre is going to meet them. Our armies are in the east, in the very place where they ought to be, on the true frontier, at the door of their home. But they have to deal with a treacherous and cowardly opponent that instead of marching face to face, leaps the walls of the corral like sheep stealers. Their underhanded tricks won't do them any good, though. The French are already in Belgium and adjusting the accounts of the Germans. We shall smash them so effectually that never again will they be able to disturb the peace of the world. And that accursed individual with a rampant mustache we are going to put in a cage and exhibit in the Place de la Concorde." Inspired by the paternal braggadocio, Chichi also launched forth exultingly an imaginary series of avenging torments and insults as a complement to this imperial exhibition. These allusions to the Emperor aggravated Frau von Hartrott more than anything else. In the first days of the war, her sister had surprised her weeping before the newspaper caricatures and leaflets sold in the streets. Such an excellent man, so knightly, such a good father to his family. He wasn't to blame for anything. It was his enemies who forced him to assume the offensive. Her veneration for exalted personages was making her take the attacks upon this admired grandee as though they were directed against her own family. One night in the dining room she abandoned her tragic silence. Certain sarcasms shot by Desnoyers at her hero brought the tears to her eyes, and this sentimental indulgence turned her thoughts upon her sons, who were undoubtedly taking part in the invasion. Her brother-in-law was longing for the extermination of all the enemy. "May every barbarian be exterminated! Every one of the bandits in pointed helmets who have just burned Louvain and other towns, shooting defenseless peasants, old men, women and children." "You forget that I am a mother," sobbed Frau von Hartrott. "You forget that among those whose extermination you are imploring are my sons." Her violent weeping made Desnoyers realize more than ever the abyss yawning between him and this woman lodged in his own house. His resentment, however, overleapt family considerations. She might weep for her sons all she wanted to. That was her right. But these sons were aggressors and wantonly doing evil. It was the other mothers who were inspiring his pity, those who were living tranquilly in their smiling little Belgian towns when their sons were suddenly shot down, their daughters violated, and their houses burned to the ground. As though this description of the horrors of war were a fresh insult to her, Dona Elena wept harder than ever. What falsehoods! The Kaiser was an excellent man. His soldiers were gentlemen. The German army was a model of civilization and goodness. Her husband had belonged to this army. Her sons were marching in its ranks, and she knew her sons, well bred and incapable of wrongdoing. These Belgian calumnies she could no longer listen to, and with dramatic abandon she flung herself into the arms of her sister. Senor Desnoyers raged against the fate that condemned him to live under the same roof with this woman. What an unfortunate complication for the family! And the frontiers were closed, making it impossible to get rid of her. "Very well, then," he thundered, "let us talk no more about it. We shall never reach an understanding, for we belong to two different worlds. It's a great pity that you can't go back to your own people." After that he refrained from mentioning the war in his sister-in-law's presence. Chichi was the only one keeping up her aggressive and noisy enthusiasm. Upon reading in the papers the news of the shootings, sackings, burnings of cities, and the dolorous flight of those who had seen their all reduced to ashes, she again felt the necessity of assuming the role of lady assassin. Ay, if she could only once get her hands on one of those bandits! What did the men amount to, anyway, if they couldn't exterminate the whole lot? Then she would look at Rene in his exquisitely fresh uniform, sweet-mannered and smiling as though all war meant to him was a mere change of attire, and she would exclaim enigmatically, "What luck that you will never have to go to the front! How fine that you don't run any risks!" And her lover would accept these words as but another proof of her affectionate interest. One day Don Marcelo was able to appreciate the horrors of war without leaving Paris. 3,000 Belgian refugees were quartered provisionally in the circus before being distributed among the provinces. When Desnoyers entered this place, he saw in the vestibule the same posters which had been flaunting their spectacular gaieties when he had visited it a few months before with his family. Now he noticed the odor from a sick and miserable multitude crowded together, like the exhalation from a prison or poorhouse infirmary. He saw a throng that seemed crazy or stupefied with grief. They did not know exactly where they were. They had come thither, they didn't know how. The terrible spectacle of the invasion was still so persistent in their minds that it left room for no other impression. They were still seeing the helmeted men in their peaceful hamlets, their homes in flames, the soldiery firing upon those who were fleeing, the mutilated women done to death by incessant adulterous assault, the old men burned alive, the children stabbed in their cradles by human beasts inflamed by alcohol and license. Some of the octogenarians were weeping as they told how the soldiers of a civilized nation were cutting off the breasts from the women in order to nail them on the doors, how they had passed around as a trophy a newborn babe spiked on a bayonet, how they had shot aged men in the very armchair in which they were huddled in their sorrowful weakness, torturing them first with their jests and taunts. They had fled blindly, pursued by fire and shot, as crazed with terror as the people of the Middle Ages, trying not to be ridden down by the hordes of galloping Huns and Mongols. And this flight had been across the country in its loveliest festal array, in the most productive of months, when the earth was bristling with ears of grain, when the August sky was most brilliant, and when the birds were greeting the opulent harvest with their glad songs. In that circus, filled with the wandering crowds, the immense crime was living again. The children were crying with a sound like the bleating of lambs. The men were looking wildly around with terrified eyes. The frenzied women were howling like the insane. Families had become separated in the terror of flight. A mother of 5 little ones now had but one. The parents, as they realized the number missing, were thinking with anguish of those who had disappeared. Would they ever find them again? Or were they already dead? End of section 33. Before Part 2, Chapter 3 continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Don Marcelo returned home grinding his teeth and waving his cane in an alarming manner. Ah, the bandits! If only his sister-in-law could change her sex! Why wasn't she a man? It would be better still if she could suddenly assume the form of her husband, von Hartrott. What an interesting interview the two brothers in law would have! The war was awakening religious sentiment in the men and increasing the devotion of the women. The churches were filled. Dona Luisa was no longer confining herself to those of her neighborhood. With the courage induced by extraordinary events, she was traversing Paris afoot, and going from the Madeleine to Notre Dame, or to the Sacre Coeur on the heights of Montmartre. Religious festivals were now thronged like popular assemblies. The preachers were tribunes. Patriotic enthusiasm interrupted many sermon with applause. Each morning, on opening the papers, before reading the war news, Senora Desnoyers would hunt other notices. Where was Father Amet going to be today? Then, under the arched vaultings of that temple, would she unite her voice with the devout chorus, imploring supernatural intervention. Lord, save France. Patriotic religiosity was putting Sainte Genevieve at the head of the favored ones. So from all these fiestas, Dona Luisa, tremulous with faith, would return in expectation of a miracle similar to that which the patron saint of Paris had worked before the invading hordes of Attila. Dona Elena was also visiting the churches, but those nearest the house. Her brother-in-law saw her one afternoon entering Saint Honoré d'Eylau. The building was filled with the faithful, and on the altar was a sheaf of flags, France and the allied nations. The imploring crowd was not composed entirely of women. Desnoyers saw men of his age, pompous and grave, moving their lips and fixing steadfast eyes on the altar, on which were reflected like lost stars the flames of the candles. And again he felt envy. They were fathers who were recalling their childhood prayers, thinking of their sons in battle. Don Marcelo, who had always considered religion with indifference, suddenly recognized the necessity of faith. He wanted to pray like the others, with a vague, indefinite supplication, including all beings who were struggling and dying for a land that he had not tried to defend. He was scandalized to see von Hartrott's wife kneeling among these people, raising her eyes to the cross in a look of anguished entreaty. She was begging heaven to protect her husband, the German who perhaps at this moment was concentrating all his devilish faculties on the best organization for crushing the weak. She was praying for her sons, officers of the King of Prussia, who, revolver in hand, were entering villages and farmlands, driving before them a horror-stricken crowd, leaving behind them fire and death. And these orisons were going to mingle with those of the mothers who were praying for the youth, trying to check the onslaught of the barbarians, with the petitions of these earnest men rigid in their tragic grief. He had to make a great effort not to protest aloud, and he left the church. His sister-in-law had no right to kneel there among those people. "They ought to put her out," he growled indignantly. "She is compromising God with her absurd entreaties." But in spite of his annoyance, he had to endure her living in his household, and at the same time had taken great pains to prevent her nationality being known outside. It was a severe trial for Don Marcelo to be obliged to keep silent when at table with his family. He had to avoid the hysterics of his sister-in-law, who promptly burst into sighs and sobs at the slightest allusion to her hero. And he feared equally the complaints of his wife, always ready to defend her sister, as though she were the victim. That a man in his own home should have to curb his tongue and speak tactfully. The only satisfaction permitted him was to announce the military moves. The French had entered Belgium. It appears that the Boches have had a good setback. The slightest clash of cavalry, a simple encounter with the advanced troops, he would glorify as a decisive victory. In Lorraine, too, we are making great headway. But suddenly the fountain of his bubbling optimism seemed to become choked up. To judge from the periodicals, nothing extraordinary was occurring. They continued publishing war stories so as to keep enthusiasm at fever heat, but nothing definite. The government, too, was issuing communications of vague and rhetorical verbosity. Desnoyers became alarmed, his instinct warning him of danger. "There is something wrong," he thought. "There's a spring broken somewhere." This lack of encouraging news coincided exactly with the sudden rise in Dona Elena's spirits. With whom had that woman been talking? Whom did she meet when she was on the street? Without dropping her pose as a martyr, with the same woebegone look and drooping mouth, she was talking, and talking treacherously. The torment of Don Marcelo in being obliged to listen to the enemy harbored within his gates. The French had been vanquished in Lorraine and in Belgium at the same time. A body of the army had deserted the colors. Many prisoners, many cannon were captured. "Lies! German exaggerations!" howled Desnoyers. And Chichi, with the derisive ha-has of an insolent girl, drowned out the triumphant communications of the aunt from Berlin. "I don't know, of course," said the unwelcome lodger with mock humility. "Perhaps it is not authentic. I have heard it said—" Her host was furious. Where had she heard it said? Who was giving her such news? And in order to ventilate his wrath, he broke forth into tirades against the enemy's espionage, against the carelessness of the police force in permitting so many Germans to remain hidden in Paris. Then he suddenly became quiet, thinking of his own behavior in this line. He, too, was involuntarily contributing toward the maintenance and support of the foe. The fall of the ministry and the constitution of a government of national defense made it apparent that something very important must have taken place. The alarms and tears of Dona Luisa increased his nervousness. The good lady was no longer returning from the churches cheered and strengthened. Her confidential talks with her sister were filling her with a terror that she tried in vain to communicate to her husband. "All is lost! Elena is the only one that knows the truth." Desnoyers went in search of Senator Lacour. He would know all the ministers, and no one could be better informed. "Yes, my friend," said the important man sadly, "two great losses at Morange and Charleroi, at the east and the north. The enemy is going to invade French soil, but our army is intact and will retreat in good order. Good fortune may still be ours. A great calamity, but all is not lost." Preparations for the defense of Paris were being pushed forward rather late. The forts were supplying themselves with new cannon. Houses, built in the danger zone in the piping times of peace, were now disappearing under the blows of the official demolition. The trees on the outer avenues were being felled in order to enlarge the horizon. Barricades of sacks of earth and tree trunks were heaped at the doors of the old walls. The curious were skirting the suburbs in order to gaze at the recently dug trenches and the barbed wire fences. The Bois de Boulogne was filled with herds of cattle. Near heaps of dry alfalfa, steers and sheep were grouped in the green meadows. Protection against famine was uppermost in the minds of a people still remembering the suffering of 1870. Every night the street lighting was less and less. The sky, on the other hand, was streaked incessantly by the shafts from the searchlights. Fear of aerial invasion was increasing the public uneasiness. Timid people were speaking of Zeppelins, attributing to them irresistible powers, with all the exaggeration that accompanies mysterious dangers. In her panic, Dona Luisa greatly distressed her husband, who was passing the days in continual alarm, yet trying to put heart into his trembling and anxious wife. "They are going to come, Marcelo. My heart tells me so. The girl! The girl!" She was accepting blindly all the statements made by her sister, the only thing that comforted her being the chivalry and discipline of those troops to which her nephews belonged. The news of the atrocities committed against the women of Belgium were received with the same credulity as the enemy's advances announced by Elena. "Our girl, Marcelo, our girl!" And the girl, object of so much solicitude, would laugh with the assurance of vigorous youth on hearing of her mother's anxiety. "Just let the shameless fellows come.
I shall take great pleasure in seeing them face to face." And she clenched her right hand as though it already clutched the avenging knife. The father became tired of this situation. He still had one of his monumental automobiles that an outside chauffeur could manage. Senator Lacour obtained the necessary passports, and Desnoyers gave his wife her orders in a tone that admitted of no remonstrance. They must go to Biarritz or to some of the summer resorts in the north of Spain. Almost all the South American families had already gone in the same direction. Dona Luisa tried to object. It was impossible for her to separate herself from her husband. Never before in their many years of married life had they once been separated. But a harsh negative from Don Marcelo cut her pleading short. He would remain. Then the poor senora ran to the Rue de la Pompe. Her son, Julio, scarcely listened to his mother. Ay, he too would stay. So finally the imposing automobile lumbered toward the south, carrying Dona Luisa, her sister who hailed with delight this withdrawal before the admired troops of the Emperor, and Chichi, pleased that the war was necessitating an excursion to the fashionable beaches frequented by her friends. Don Marcelo was at last alone. The two coppery maids had followed by rail the flight of their mistresses. At first the old man felt a little bewildered by this solitude, which obliged him to eat uncomfortable meals in a restaurant and pass the nights in enormous and deserted rooms, still bearing traces of their former occupants. The other apartments in the building had also been vacated. All the tenants were foreigners who had discreetly decamped, or French families surprised by the war when summering at their country seats. Instinctively he turned his steps toward the Rue de la Pompe, gazing from afar at the studio windows. What was his son doing? Undoubtedly continuing his gay and useless life. Such men only existed for their own selfish folly. Desnoyers felt satisfied with the stand he had taken. To follow the family would be sheer cowardice. The memory of his youthful flight to South America was sufficient martyrdom. He would finish his life with all the compensating bravery that he could muster. "No, they will not come," he said repeatedly, with the optimism of enthusiasm. "I have a presentiment that they will never reach Paris. And even if they do come!" The absence of his family brought him a joyous valor and a sense of bold youthfulness. Although his age might prevent his going to war in the open air, he could still fire a gun, immovable in a trench, without fear of death. Let them come. He was longing for the struggle with the anxiety of a punctilious business man wishing to cancel a former debt as soon as possible. In the streets of Paris he met many groups of fugitives. They were from the north and east of France, and had escaped before the German advance. Of all the tales told by this despondent crowd, not knowing where to go and dependent upon the charity of the people, he was most impressed with those dealing with the disregard of property. Shootings and assassinations made him clench his fists with threats of vengeance, but the robberies authorized by the heads, the wholesale sacking by superior order, followed by fire, appeared to him so unheard of that he was silent with stupefaction, his speech seeming to be temporarily paralyzed. And a people with laws could wage war in this fashion, like a tribe of Indians going to combat in order to rob. His adoration of property rights made him beside himself with wrath at these sacrileges. End of section 34.
Chapter 3 continued of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He began to worry about his castle at Villeblanche. All that he owned in Paris suddenly seemed to him of slight importance to what he had in his historic mansion. His best paintings were there, adorning the gloomy salons. There, too, the furnishings captured from the antiquarians after an auctioneering battle, and the crystal cabinets, the tapestries, the silver services. He mentally reviewed all these objects, not letting a single one escape his inventory. Things that he had forgotten came surging up in his memory, and the fear of losing them seemed to give them greater luster, increasing their size and intensifying their value. All the riches of Villeblanche were concentrated in one certain acquisition which Desnoyers admired most of all, for to his mind it stood for all the glory of his immense fortune, in fact the most luxurious appointment that even a millionaire could possess. "My golden bath," he thought. "I have there my tub of gold." This bath of priceless metal he had procured after much financial wrestling from an auction, and he considered the purchase the culminating achievement of his wealth. No one knew exactly its origin. Perhaps it had been the property of luxurious princes; perhaps it owed its existence to the caprice of a demi mondaine fond of display. He and his had woven a legend around this golden cavity adorned with lions' claws, dolphins, and busts of naiads. Undoubtedly it was once a king's. Chichi gravely affirmed that it had been Marie Antoinette's, and the entire family thought that the home on the avenue Victor Hugo was altogether too modest and plebeian to enshrine such a jewel. They therefore agreed to put it in the castle, where it was greatly venerated, although it was useless and solemn as a museum piece. And was he to permit the enemy in their advance toward the Marne to carry off this priceless treasure, as well as the other gorgeous things which he had accumulated with such patience? Ah, no! His soul of a collector would be capable of the greatest heroism before he would let that go. Each day was bringing a fresh sheaf of bad news. The papers were saying little, and the government was so veiling in its communications that the mind was left in great perplexity. Nevertheless, the truth was mysteriously forcing its way, impelled by the pessimism of the alarmists and the manipulation of the enemy's spies, who were remaining hidden in Paris. The fatal news was being passed along in whispers. "They have already crossed the frontier. They are already in Lille. They were advancing at the rate of 35 miles a day." The name of von Kluck was beginning to have a familiar ring. English and French were retreating before the enveloping progression of the invaders. Some were expecting another Sedan. Desnoyers was following the advance of the Germans, going daily to the Gare du Nord. Every 24 hours was lessening the radius of travel. Bulletins announcing that tickets would not be sold for the northern districts served to indicate how these places were falling, one after the other, into the power of the invader. The shrinkage of national territory was going on with such methodical regularity that, with watch in hand and allowing an advance of 35 miles daily, one might gauge the hour when the lances of the first Uhlans would salute the Eiffel Tower. The trains were running full, great bunches of people overflowing from their coaches. In this time of greatest anxiety, Desnoyers again visited his friend, Senator Lacour, in order to astound him with the most unheard of petitions. He wished to go immediately to his castle. While everybody else was fleeing toward Paris, he earnestly desired to go in the opposite direction. The senator couldn't believe his ears. "You are beside yourself!" he exclaimed. "It is necessary to leave Paris, but toward the south. I will tell you confidentially, and you must not tell, because it is a secret. We are leaving at any minute. We are all going. The president, the government, the chambers. We are going to establish ourselves at Bordeaux as in 1870. The enemy is surely approaching. It is only a matter of days, of hours. We know little of just what is happening, but all the news is bad. The army still holds firm, is yet intact but retreating.
retreating all the time, yielding ground. Believe me, it will be better for you to leave Paris. Gallieni will defend it, but the defense is going to be hard and horrible. Although Paris may surrender, France will not necessarily surrender. The war will go on, if necessary, even to the frontiers of Spain. But it is sad, very sad." And he offered to take his friend with him in that flight to Bordeaux, of which so few yet knew. Desnoyers shook his head. No, he wanted to go to the castle of Villeblanche, his furniture, his riches, his parks. "But you will be taken prisoner," protested the senator. "Perhaps they will kill you." A shrug of indifference was the only response. He considered himself energetic enough to struggle against the entire German army in the defense of his property. The important thing was to get there, and then just let anybody dare to touch his things. The senator looked with astonishment at this civilian infuriated by the lust of possession. It reminded him of some Arab merchants that he had once known, ordinarily mild and pacific, who quarreled and killed like wild beasts when Bedouin thieves seized their wares. This was not the moment for discussion, and each must map out his own course. So the influential senator finally yielded to the desire of his friend. If such was his pleasure, let him carry it through. So he arranged that his mad petitioner should depart on that very night on a military train that was going to meet the army. That journey put Don Marcelo in touch with the extraordinary movement which the war had developed on the railroads. His train took 14 hours to cover the distance normally made in 2. It was made up of freight cars filled with provisions and cartridges, with the doors stamped and sealed. A third-class car was occupied by the train escort, a detachment of provincial guards. He was installed in a second-class compartment with the lieutenant in command of this guard and certain officials on their way to join their regiments after having completed the business of mobilization in the small towns in which they were stationed before the war. The crowd, habituated to long detentions, was accustomed to getting out and settling down before the motionless locomotive or scattering through the nearby fields. In the stations of any importance, all the tracks were occupied by rows of cars. High-pressure engines were whistling, impatient to be off. Groups of soldiers were hesitating before the different trains, making mistakes, getting out of one coach to enter others. The employees, calm but weary-looking, were going from side to side, giving explanations about mountains of all sorts of freight and arranging them for transport. In the convoy in which Desnoyers was placed, the territorials were sleeping, accustomed to the monotony of acting as guard. Those in charge of the horses had opened the sliding doors, seating themselves on the floor with their legs hanging over the edge. The train went very slowly during the night across shadowy fields, stopping here and there before red lanterns and announcing its presence by prolonged whistling. In some stations appeared young girls clad in white, with cockades and pennants on their breasts. Day and night they were there, in relays, so that no train should pass through without a visit. They offered, in baskets and trays, their gifts to the soldiers: bread, chocolate, fruit. Many, already surfeited, tried to resist, but had to yield eventually before the pleading countenance of the maidens. Even Desnoyers was laden down with these gifts of patriotic enthusiasm. He passed a great part of the night talking with his traveling companions. Only the officers had vague directions as to where they were to meet their regiments, for the operations of war were daily changing the situation. Faithful to duty, they were passing on, hoping to arrive in time for the decisive combat. The chief of the guard had been over the ground and was the only one able to give any account of the retreat. After each stop, the train made less progress. Everybody appeared confused. Why the retreat? The army had undoubtedly suffered reverses, but it was still united and, in his opinion, ought to seek an engagement where it was. The retreat was leaving the advance of the enemy unopposed. To what point were they going to retreat? They who 2 weeks before were discussing in their garrisons the place in Belgium where their adversaries were going to receive their death blow, and through what places their victorious troops would invade Germany. Their admission of the change of tactics did not reveal the slightest discouragement. An indefinite but firm hope was hovering triumphantly above their vacillations. The generalissimo was the only one who possessed the secret of events, and Desnoyers approved with the blind enthusiasm inspired by those in whom we have confidence. Joffre, that serious and calm leader, would finally bring things out all right. Nobody ought to doubt his ability. He was the kind of man who always says the decisive word. At daybreak, Don Marcelo left the train. "Good luck to you!" And he clasped the hands of the brave young fellows who were going to die, perhaps in a very short time. Finding the road unexpectedly open, the train started immediately, and Desnoyers found himself alone in the station. In normal times, a branch road would have taken him on to Villeblanche, but the service was now suspended for lack of a train crew. The employees had been transferred to the lines crowded with the war transportation. In vain he sought, with most generous offers, a horse, a simple cart drawn by any kind of old beast, in order to continue his trip. The mobilization had appropriated the best, and all other means of transportation had disappeared with the flight of the terrified. He would have to walk the 8 miles. The old man did not hesitate. Forward march! And he began his course along the dusty, straight, white highway running between an endless succession of plains. Some groups of trees, some green hedges, and the roofs of various farms broke the monotony of the countryside. The fields were covered with stubble from the recent harvest. The haycocks dotted the ground with their yellowish cones, now beginning to darken and take on a tone of oxidized gold. In the valleys, the birds were flitting about, shaking off the dew of dawn. The first rays of sun announced a very hot day. Around the haystacks, Desnoyers saw knots of people who were getting up, shaking out their clothes, and awaking those who were still sleeping. They were fugitives camping near the station in the hope that some train would carry them further on, they knew not where. Some had come from faraway districts. They had heard the cannon, had seen war approaching, and for several days had been going forward, directed by chance. Others, infected with the contagion of panic, had fled, fearing to know the same horrors. Among them he saw mothers with their little ones in their arms, and old men who could only walk with a cane in one hand and the other arm in that of some member of the family, and a few old women, withered and motionless as mummies, who were sleeping as they were trundled along in wheelbarrows. When the sun awoke this miserable band, they gathered themselves together with heavy step, still stiffened by the night. Many were going toward the station in the hope of a train which never came, thinking that perhaps they might have better luck during the day that was just dawning. Some were continuing their way down the track, hoping that fate might be more propitious in some other place. Don Marcelo walked all the morning long. The white rectilinear ribbon of roadway was spotted with the approaching groups that on the horizon line looked like a file of ants. He did not see a single person going in his direction. All were fleeing toward the south. And on meeting this city gentleman, well shod, with walking stick and straw hat, going on alone toward the country which they were abandoning in terror, they showed the greatest astonishment. They concluded that he must be some functionary, some celebrity from the government. At midday he was able to get a bit of bread, a little cheese, and a bottle of white wine from a tavern near the road. The proprietor was at the front, his wife sick and moaning in her bed. The mother, a rather deaf old woman, surrounded by her grandchildren, was watching from the doorway the procession of fugitives which had been filing by for the last 3 days. "Monsieur, why do they flee?" she said to Desnoyers. "War only concerns the soldiers. We country folk have done no wrong to anybody, and we ought not to be afraid." 4 hours later, on descending one of the hills that bounded the valley of the Marne, he saw afar the roofs of Villeblanche clustered around the church, and further on, beyond a little grove, the slaty points of the round towers of his castle. The streets of the village were deserted. Only on the outer edges of the square did he see some old women sitting as in the placid evenings of bygone summers. Half of the neighborhood had fled. The others were staying by their firesides through sedentary routine, or deceiving themselves with a blind optimism. If the Prussians should approach, what could they do to them? They would obey their orders without attempting any resistance, and it is impossible to punish people who obey. Anything would be preferable to losing the homes built by their forefathers, which they had never left. Section 35.